Hello, explorers. On the northern coast of the Golden Sea is the Kingdom of Palisaur, one of the last remaining monarchies in South Milgana, alongside Schistine. Smaller in population than all of its neighbors, Palisaur finds itself in a unique position in modern Milgana. The Kingdom of Palisaur has a population of 14.2 million people, most of whom are ethnic Palis. However, there's a sizable minority of Leaves in the north. Speaking of the north, that's the most mountainous region of the kingdom, with the center being more hilly and the south very flat and fertile, especially in the southeast. Palisaur is divided into 8 domains, which each have their own regional governments. These 8 domains are actually a more recent development, coming after the Pali Civil War, but I'll get back to that later. As you might have guessed, there's a king in charge of the Kingdom of Palisaur. The current king is King Celior IV, who became king in 417. With the basic introduction done, let's look more into the demographics of Palisaur. With 14.2 million people, Palisaur is the 11th most populated nation on Milgana, just behind its northern neighbor Trovtal. As mentioned before, the largest ethnic group are Palis, which make up 72.5% of the population. The largest minority group is the Leaves, primarily in the northern domain of Leavesor, where they make up 88% of the local domain's population. After the Leaves, smaller groups of Tishas and Ligasinas reside in the kingdom as well, though not in very significant numbers. The eastern part of the country, around the Gisal River and its tributaries, is by far the most populated, with most of the population living along the river system. 4 of the 5 biggest cities are also on the rivers in the Gisal River system. The 5 biggest cities, in order, are Dershar, Lisapo, Hisol, Polsemor, and Nishinla. Only Lisapo, the capital, is located away from the east, instead being in the far less populated west. This was originally so the royal family could be far away from the busy crowds of the east, although as Lisapo is now the second most populated city, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Following the Civil War, Palisaur's population has been rapidly expanding, going from 8.7 million to the current 14.2 million in only 27 years. This has led to the median age decreasing, and as a result, the Royal Pali Education Administration was founded, becoming the first public education system in all of Milgana. The system provides free education for children from ages 6 to 14. Afterwards, Dershar University and the Royal Esipa Institute in Lisapo are the 2 biggest higher education institutions. The education of Palisaur has been a source of pride in the kingdom, as was intended by the Esipa royal family in their publicity campaign that has been ongoing since the end of the Civil War. I'll touch on this more in the Geopolitics section later, but for now just note that this campaign has led not only to increased popularity for the royal family, but also higher standards of living than most in Milgana. Historically, the Kingdom of Palisaur has remained largely the same for millennia. In 3451, the kingdom as we know it today was founded out of a union between Pali-speaking city-states in Dershar and Nishinla. In 2363, a war broke out between Palisaur and the Old Ligas Kingdom, resulting in Palisaur losing these territories in the east. Following the defeat, King Araso II drowned himself, which led to a short-lived civil war between his twin sons for the throne. Eventually, the war was won by King Araso III, who invaded the Leave-speaking duchy of Gilonri in the north and annexed it into the kingdom. The major event that we're looking at, though, is the more recent Pali Civil War, beginning in 415. In 411, the Ligas Kingdom had fully collapsed, splitting into 3 republics. Now, the why and how isn't important right now, that's for another video, but what's important is that during the ensuing war, many Palis were hired to fight, and traveled to do so. As tends to happen in war, there's plenty of looting and pillaging going on, and so a very small subset of those who went to fight came back extremely wealthy. Not only that, but following the war, most of these soldiers found that they were quite fond of the new Republican governments to the east. Several Republican newspapers would be started, with the Dershar intellectual becoming the most popular. Eventually, on the 12th day of autumn in 415, a group called the Students of Hersenal stormed the royal armory in Dershar, successfully overpowering the garrison and declaring the formation of the Republic of Palisaur. In the early hours of the morning after taking over the armory, as dozens of royal footmen sat restrained in the Dershar central square, the leader of the incident, Hesirn Villapos, gave a speech to the confused citizens of Dershar. Speaking for over an hour in the cold wind, the most memorable part of his speech would be this. "We have seized the king's armory. We have conquered his soldiers and taken his city. Why, then, can I only hear the wind? Where are the cannons, the guns, the fire? If this king truly cared, would he be 4 days' journey from us? Would he hide himself away in a castle so far from so many of his loyal subjects, ruling as he sees fit without ever having to spend even a day amongst us? I see no king here in Dashar, but I see so many of us. It is only fitting that we, who truly understand what it means to live in this kingdom of Palisaur, should decide the future of our nation, in the form of a new and glorious republic that will in time be even greater than Tashor to the west and Ligasort to the east. Following the first battle of Dashar, which was barely a battle, the civil war would begin in earnest. Upon the news spreading to the nearby cities of Gidstem and Shemel, similar uprisings took place, with the leaders of these revolts soon joining forces with the students of Ursenel, forming what would be known as the Republican Army of Palisaur, usually just called the Republicans. Not everyone was in favor, however, with the opposing side, the Essapins, fighting to keep the royal family in power. In one instance, the mayor of Hisol declared himself an Essapin, and was promptly murdered by an angry mob that stormed his manor. Overall, the populated east was mostly Republican, with the west and center being more in favor of the king. The Leve population in the north was mostly neutral, although small numbers would fight for both sides, with Leofego being temporarily occupied by the Republicans. Proper battles would begin breaking out across the nation, although primarily concentrated in the east. By summer of 416, the Republicans had reached their greatest territorial control, controlling the vast majority of the east, as well as a few pockets in the west too, which constituted more than 2/3 of the entire kingdom's population. The turning point, however, was the Battle of Separilis in winter of 417. As the Republican army marched towards Lisapo, the desperate King Celior III abdicated the throne, giving control of the war-torn kingdom to his son, Celior IV. The new king immediately gave a speech to the citizens of Lisapo, thanking them for their loyalty and doing something that was seen as radical for the time, arming the public. He opened the armory to the common people, and promised wide tracts of land for those who took up arms to defend the city. This meant that, while filled with untrained soldiers who barely knew how to use their weapons, the Essapin army was triple the size the Republicans, most of whom were also untrained, were expecting. On the 34th day of winter, the Essapins, led by Celior himself, surrounded the town of Separilis in the middle of the night, as the Republicans were sheltered there for the night. Moving as quietly as possible, a few Essapin soldiers snuck into the town and set fire to multiple buildings, causing chaos and killing hundreds of Republican soldiers as the rest of the Essapin army moved in. The Republican General Gilsan Vagila surrendered in just 2 hours, with 32,000 of the 75,000 Republican soldiers being killed, compared to just 3,000 casualties on the Essapin side. The battle was more akin to a massacre, and with morale shattered and the largest army collapsed, the entire republic capitulated within 6 weeks afterwards. With the end of the Civil War, many expected a brutal campaign of reprisal from both the new king and the Essapin faction. But in a shock to the entire kingdom, Celior IV actually pardoned all but the highest-ranking leaders of the Republican movement, and began a campaign of devolution and public works. The 8 domains as we see them today were formed, each with a regional government and their own limited ability to self-govern. Universities were funded, public welfare systems like education as mentioned earlier, and a very rudimentary hospital network were set up, funded primarily by the silver mines in western Palisaur. Today, Palisaur is a constitutional monarchy ruled officially by the Essapa family. However, the Royal Advisory Assembly also holds significant power. The assembly is split into 2 houses, the Royal Congress and the People's Estate. While not very democratic, this reform has led to a system much more in touch with the people of the kingdom, which has proven crucial in keeping another rebellion from starting. Let's look more in depth at the Royal Advisory Assembly, starting with the Royal Congress, the upper house. The Congress is comprised of 48 members, 6 from each domain. These members are not elected by the people in their domains, rather appointed by the governors of each domain, which in turn have all been appointed by the king. However, the position of governor is an inherited one, meaning that future governors will not necessarily be aligned exactly with Lisapo. Since the entire domain and governor system is so new, all but one of the current governors were appointed directly by the king, with the only exception being the governor of Pavirsi, Nisvilo Elpira, who took over from his father in 439. Most of the members of the Congress are wealthy landowners, with only a few exceptions. The Congress is responsible for proposing most budgetary legislation, declaring war, and possesses a veto over the king's decrees. Political parties are officially forbidden in the Congress, although in practice members are still very factional, based on things like regions and values. Next, as evidenced by its name, the People's Estate is a bit more democratic. The People's Estate is comprised of 80 members, 10 from each domain. You might be wondering why this house also uses a flat number as opposed to a portioned representation, and this is actually a very intentional design by the royal family. The East, the region that rose up in the first place, is by far the most densely populated part of Palisaur. Begrudgingly, the king acknowledged it would be unreasonable and blatant if he didn't draw the domain's borders to reflect this. However, not wanting to allow a complete takeover of the estate by the Republicans, he flatly rejected the idea of proportional representation, and so the estate has its 80 members. These members are actually elected, however each domain sets its own standards for who is able to vote. In the most restrictive, Shansiln, only men with significant amounts of property and who pass a basic Pali civics test are able to vote. By contrast, in Eldansor, all men, as well as women who own property, are able to vote. Members of the People's Estate serve for 10-year terms, with 2 members in each domain up for re-election every other year. This specific arrangement led to the odd situation of an estate that wasn't actually filled until 10 years after its establishment, as 16 members joined every other year. The estate is responsible for introducing most common legislation, though it must be approved by the Congress, as well as overseeing public institutions like education and health, and appointing judges. Both houses are still subservient to the king. The Asapa family officially rules over all of the kingdom of Palisaur as their realm, with King Celior IV as its current monarch. Though not absolute in power as they once were, the royal family is still very much in charge of the nation, even in spite of their fears of another uprising. The king is responsible for signing off on all legislation and budgets passed by the Royal Advisory Assembly, though in practice he hardly ever uses his veto. This, however, is only a personal decision by Celior, and his future successor may be far less conservative in his use of the veto. Regardless, the king is also able to pass royal decrees, though controversially, the Congress is able to veto these decrees and render them void. This has never happened, and it's unclear if the king would even abide by this veto if it were used. The allowance of a veto was so controversial, in fact, that King Celior III, well after abdicating, denounced his son and attempted to seize control back from his son in a small coup. However, the coup had absolutely no success, with most of its conspirators being executed and the former king himself being confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. By far the biggest industry and moneymaker for Palisaur is the series of silver mines in the west, around which the cities of Stegun and Elstiri formed. All but 2 of the silver mines are owned by the royal family themselves, who only in the aftermath of the Civil War have begun using part of the revenue for public welfare. The few mines not owned directly are owned by the Pali Silver Company, a private company which is allowed only to lease the land for their mines as a favor to their founder, who assisted the royal family in the Civil War. Palisaur is far from the wealthiest nation in South Milgana, being outmatched by Tishor to the west and New Ligasort to the east in revenue. However, this doesn't mean Palisaur isn't doing well for themselves. On the contrary, quality of life is better than ever in Palisaur, thanks to both to the silver industry as well as the chief port city of Pulsemer, which is the choke point for over 80% of their trade with foreign nations. Out of Pulsemer flows not just silver, most of which isn't actually exported through there anyway, but also textiles, dyes, and herbs grown throughout the central and southern plains of Palisaur. While private companies are allowed to operate in Palisaur, the heavy restrictions on them mean that the only real way to start a successful company is to be well-connected and well-liked by the people in power. Nonetheless, Palisaur is currently experiencing record economic growth, and nationwide happiness is at a high. By far the biggest geopolitical problem for the government of Palisaur is its neighbors. Tishor and New Ligasort are both republics. While Pali people are more than friendly with their ethnic cousins in both nations, the government faces a far bigger headache. The entire civil war was a result of Republican sentiment spreading from Ligasort into Palisaur, and the king has been keen to prevent it from taking root once again. The entire strategy of launching reform and public welfare programs was not out of a desire to assist his subjects, rather a way to appease them and show that it's not so bad to be under a king. This strategy does seem to have worked, with Republican ideals less popular now than even 10 years before the Civil War, though they haven't disappeared entirely. During the Civil War, it was obvious that the governments of New Ligasort and Tishor both supported the Republicans, and were disappointed at the royal victory. It took years for New Ligasort to resume regular trade with Palisaur, despite the fact that the nation had been trading with the Republicans just fine when they controlled Pulsimer. Tishor, for their part, had offered condolences to the royal family at the end of the war, stating that any war which divides a people against themselves is a tragedy, and we wish our brotherly nation well in this time of mourning. While it seems nice at first, it was almost certainly backhanded, as it came as Lissapa was abuzz with celebration at their victory, and the few executions that took place were already finished. King Celior has attempted, thus far unsuccessfully, to play off of both Tishor and New Ligasort, using threats of the other's economic dominance to try and secure investments. While it hasn't worked, that hasn't dissuaded the king from trying. The second major issue for Palisaur is the Commonwealth of Trovdal. A relatively new nation only formed after the war between the lakes, Trovdal has not been subtle about their desire to own the Leave-populated regions of northern Palisaur. This is also an issue for Tishor, New Ligasort, and North Ligasort, but that's not important right now. So far, only very limited Leave support has been voiced for Trovdal, mostly due to the economic prosperity in Palisaur being contrasted with the poor and oligarchic Commonwealth. However, that doesn't mean it couldn't become an issue later, and King Celior has announced plans to expand the royal road system in Leavesaur. A monarchy squeezed between two republics, the Kingdom of Palisaur has, in the aftermath of the Civil War, been able to successfully maintain its royal roots and win back the hearts of the people. With society and technology progressing ever onwards, particularly after some more recent developments in New Ligasort, will the kingdom be able to maintain its relevance into the future? That remains to be seen. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. Make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.